the listing of the bird in 1993. We'll go through a little bit of the 1995 plan, and then we'll conclude by talking in some depth of aspects of the revised Mexican spotted owl recovery plan that just recently came out. Next slide. Just a little bit of background. It was listed as a threatened species in 1993 under the Endangered Species Act. Recovery team was put together. Critical habitat was designated in 2004. The initial recovery plan took just about 2.5 years to get done, and it was signed in the end of 1995. In 1996, all forests, national forests in the southwestern region, Region 3, amended their forest plans by incorporating the Mexican Spotted Owl Recovery Plan, provisions in that as far as standards and guidelines, as well as some goshawk recommendations that came from the GTR 217. We probably started to revise the recovery plan about 2000, but it took us about 5 times longer to do a revision than it took us to do the original plan. But that came out just about at the end of 2012. So when the bird was listed, it was listed on the basis of forest management practices, primarily even-age forestry, seed tree and shelterwood cuts that tended to simplify forest structure, remove a lot of the large trees, and really move it away from what we know to be owl habitat. There was also the lack of regulatory mechanisms, and what that came down to basically was that all the forest plans that were in effect at the time called for continued silviculture using even-age management. When the recovery plan came out in 1995, we thought the threats were still forest management at the time, the lack of regulatory mechanisms, but at that point we also viewed the potential for high severity wildfire impacting large amounts of owl habitat as a threat as well. When we came out with the more recent forest plan, again, high severity wildfire probably became the primary threat that we addressed, but we also thought forest management was a potential threat as well. You know, certainly we've probably seen this over the last 16, 17 years. I think 1996 is when we started with the big fire years. You know, Radio Chetasky, Bridger Knoll, Wallow, Cerro Grande. You know, we've seen it in the news. We've seen it on TV, read about in the newspapers. Large swaths of area being burned, some of which were being burned outside the range of natural variation. You know, one of the things that people thought with all the hyperbole is that when these fires burned, it was all what people termed catastrophic, which is sort of a value-laden term. But if you looked at these fires, you could see that they were a mosaic from areas that didn't burn to areas that may have burned with high intensity, high severity, and removed stands. Next slide. So what do we know about owls in these systems? You know, we know that they evolved in these ecosystems, these fire-prone ecosystems. We also know a little bit about what owls have done following fire. Jeff Jeunesse did his master's thesis looking at occupancy by owls after fire and found that they continue to occupy areas shortly after fire. Monica Bond published a paper about the same time looking at spotted owls across all 3 ranges of subspecies and found that short-term occupancy was something that they found with all 3 subspecies. We also know from a paper recently published by Monica and others that owls that occur in green forests that borders on burn forests will continue to nest. Then they use that burn forest as a place to forage. So the burn forest does provide opportunities for them to feed. And from a lot of prey population studies that we've done following wildfire and prescribed fire, we've also found that prey populations will increase, particularly things like Paramyscus and Microtus. So we don't know quite a bit about what's going on with fire and owls. We don't know necessarily what long-term long-term occupancy will be. We know they're there for a short period of time, but we also know that birds in general tend to exhibit site fidelity. In other words, their habitat could be perturbed, but they continue to use that area, and at some point will leave. We don't know how long the owls will stay there. Say if we have turnover and the owls that are occupying an area leave, we don't know if an area will be recolonized. We don't know what reproduction rates are of birds in these burn forests, and we don't know what survival rates are of the adults or of any young they might produce. If the birds do move, we have no clue as to where they go. Do they stay within the perimeter of the burn? Do they go to green forest? We don't know. We don't know what the implications of fire are on the broader owl population. We really don't have any data on what the population size or trends are of Mexican spotted owls, let alone being able to tease apart what the effects of fire are on that broader population. And we also don't know what the effects of post-fire salvage might be on spotted owls. Often we have these large fires and people want to get in there pretty quickly and recover some of the wood fiber as quickly as they can before they actually do surveys. And we don't really know what the effects of those prescriptions are going to be. Okay, we know quite a bit about the type of habitat that owls use for nesting. It's typically mature old-growth type forests, the gnarly stuff with multi-storied canopy, big trees, usually diversity of tree species, conifers and hardwoods, a lot of decadence in the form of snags and down logs. And this type of structure provides both the thermal climate that the birds need because they are very heat intolerant, and also provides structures for roosting and nesting and prey habitat as well. But, this is the type of stuff that forest managers also often freak out about. It's the type of forest structure that can lead to strand replacing fires because you have the ground fuels, the ladder fuels that can get to the crowns. When these forests are really dense, sometimes it provides opportunities for insects and pathogens. But what we really need to know is how much of this mature old-growth forest we need on the landscape and how it should be distributed to really support the owl population. And we really don't have a very good idea of what that quantity is and what its distribution should be. So the original owl recovery plan was sort of cast a three-legged stool, and the three legs were the management recommendations, monitoring, and research. And I'm not going to talk about monitoring and research for this talk, one, because it's really not what the focus is, and second, there's not much to talk about because there really hasn't been much monitoring or much research done. But we broke the range of the owl into three management types. One was protected habitat, which included protected activity centers, and these were 600-acre areas centered on owl nests or roosts. 600 acres wasn't taken out of a hat, but it was based on some previous research that was done that showed that the 75% adaptive kernel, in other words, 75% of all activity by the owl, was within that area. The owl home range is probably 3 times that size, but at least 75% of their activities are within 600 acres. And then within that, we had a core area of 100 acres, which is about where 50% of the activities took place. Also included in protected areas were steep slopes, those greater than 40%. We also had restricted habitat. Restricted habitat was primarily pine oak forest and mixed conifer forest, and also riparian areas. And in restricted areas, what we're trying to do was to create replacement habitat and also provide opportunities for foraging and foraging and wintering birds. And outside of these areas, outside of the pine oak and mixed conifer forests, we had what we termed other forested woodland types. And these were primarily ponderosa pine forests, spruce fir, and pinyon juniper. We had no owl-specific guidelines in other forest and woodland types other than to manage for restoration. So in PACs, it wasn't necessarily hands-off in PACs in the 1995 plan. We did allow for prescribed fire in all of the PACs, provided that they were low-severity surface fires and that we wanted people to try to avoid burning in the 100-acre core areas. Then we also proposed doing something as far as treating within PACs, and this was to treat up to 10% of the PACs in a recovery unit by doing pre-commercial thinning, that is, removing trees 9 inches or below. And we wanted to monitor what the effects were so we could understand what the effects of treating 9 inches and below in PACs were on the owl. As far as in the restricted areas, we wanted to manage to produce future owl habitat, replacement owl nest habitat. We know that forests are born, they live, and they die, and as we lose nest habitat because of natural disturbance or human disturbance, we wanted some more stuff to be coming online, so we wanted to manage for it. And this was probably within about 20 to 25% of the restricted areas in mixed conifer forest and 10% of the pine oak forest. So, what have we learned from implementation of the 1995 plan? Well, to date, very few of the PACs have been treated. Very few people have gone in and removed trees 9 inches and below. There has been more done within restricted areas, but we really don't have very much data as far as habitat monitoring or population monitoring to understand what the effect of those projects were. So I've talked a little bit about where we've been, and I'm going to hand this over to Shaula and let her talk about where we're going.
Thanks, Bill. Let me know if people can't hear me or if I start talking too quickly. I'm going to go a little bit faster through some of this. I'll slow down on the recommendations, but we want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions. So I just want to start off kind of where Bill started off, in that, the recovery plan recommendations, so they're based, mostly, as they should be for a recovery plan, on the known needs of the owl. They're also, to a degree, based on what we know about the landscape the owl depends upon. And, if you look at a lot of what Franklin and others have been working on since the 90s in terms of ecological forestry, we took a very similar approach, and we did work with fire ecologists, prey ecologists, et cetera, as Bill listed out in the beginning. And this is an attempt to really try and mesh those different thoughts and processes. So the meat of the plan. The general management recommendations, again, focus on 3 categories relative to land management. And you'll recognize some of the terms from what Bill discussed in the past plan. We have protected activity centers still. Those are occupied sites. Recovery habitat, which was formerly referred to as restricted habitat in the original plan, and then other forest and woodland types. Protected activity centers, or PACs, are established around known owl sites. And if you want to know the definition of what an owl site is, you can see box C1 in the revised plan. And PACs are intended to protect and maintain currently occupied owl habitat. Given our lack of experience and demonstrated expertise in creating this type of forest structure used by owls, the recommendations for PACs really do focus on minimizing, to some extent, management within those key areas. Recovery habitat, again, formerly referred to as restricted habitat in the old plan, is that habitat that occurs in forest types and in rocky canyons used by owls for roosting, foraging, dispersal, and other life history needs, but outside of PACs. So the intent of recovery habitat is to provide protection for areas that are used by owls for these life history needs, foster the creation in a percentage of that habitat of new nest roost habitat, provide managers with greater management flexibility than is currently allowed in those occupied protected activity centers, and facilitate the development and testing, hopefully, of management strategies that maybe someday can be applied to PACs. So then again, as Bill described, the other forest and woodland types are areas that are not PACs or recovery habitat. And I should stress, recovery habitat is clearly defined in the plan. In forested habitats, it's going to be those habitats that meet the definition of pine oak or mixed conifer. And that's, like I said, in the plan. The intent of the recovery plan is to protect the owl and its habitat while simultaneously, as much as we can, minimizing conflicts with management for other resource objectives. And as you can see from the chart on the screen, PACs and recovery habitat under this plan comprise a relatively small proportion of the landscape. As we look at this here, let me see, where's my arrow? You can see PACs are approximately 3%, and then you've got recovery habitat making up about 18% of the landscape. And this data is based on data from forest inventory analysis plots. So this isn't to say that there aren't areas where protected activity centers don't make up a huge proportion of the landscape. And this example from the Sacramento district of the Lincoln National Forest gives you one example of why in some cases the recovery team really felt we needed to be looking at how we could modify forested habitat within and immediately adjacent to existing owl nest roost habitat in order to reduce fire risk to owls and the overall landscape. So as in the previous plan, I should say, the revised recovery plan still calls for the delineation of the 600-acre areas around known owl sites. As I said, owl sites are defined in box C1 of the plan, and within those PACs, we also recommend designating a 100-acre nest roost core area. And this core area should include the habitat that resembles the characteristics of the nest and our roost sites as much as possible. The intent of that core area is to define the portion of the PAC that should receive the most protection from disturbance and modification. It's that most important habitat to the birds based on what we know today. So we've also recommended as a team that where appropriate within identified PACs, including the nest core this time, light burning of surface and low-lying fuels is recommended following careful review by biologists and fuel management specialists. We recommend generally burns should be done during the non-breeding season, which is September 1 through February 28th, for those of you who don't know, and unless non-breeding is inferred or confirmed that year per the accepted survey protocol. So in some situations, like the example I just showed on the Lincoln, prescribed fire alone really may be insufficient to reduce fuels and protect or reduce risk from high severity fire to PACs. So the recovery team has looked at recommending mechanical treatments used singly or in combination with prescribed fire to reduce that risk. And we've laid out in the plan kind of a structured process for how we think that should go. And the first step is conducting a landscape level risk assessment to strategically locate and prioritize those mechanical treatments. I.e., we really think, and I think a lot of land management agencies are already doing this, that we need to start at the bigger scale and then work down, not just propose immediately going into PACs. We need to designate and identify those nest roost core areas. And then what the plan specifically says in regards to this time is that within each ecological management unit, which is the new name for recovery units. So we've gone from recovery units to ecological management units, for those of you keeping track of the terminology, that up to 20% of the non-core area PAC area within that unit can be treated, and then we would do an evaluation to see where we go from there. So again, the recommendation being treatments need to occur outside the breeding season unless non-breeding is inferred or confirmed. And then monitoring. This is the key part of this, and this is the point that we'll probably harp on over and over this afternoon. Needs to be designed and implemented to evaluate the effects of those treatments on the owls and the retention or movement of the forest conditions towards owl desired conditions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. The recovery plan defined desired conditions for management in forested habitat based upon our current knowledge of forests used by spotted owls. And our current research indicates that forest stands used by spotted owls for nesting and roosting have certain structural features in common. These aren't a big surprise, and these are fairly similar to what was lined out before in the 1995 plan, although with the science that many researchers did in between 95 and 2012, we have been able to refine these and better define them. And that table, which is table C2 in the plan, is one I highly recommend people look at, because that is really our current guidance for how we'd like to see, or what we'd like to see the aim be for treatments in PACs and for creation of nest roost replacement habitat. So I wanted to step through quickly, at least, an example of how that structured process that we laid out in the plan might look. And so if you imagine this landscape, I'll let some of you on the phone, some of you might know what this landscape is, but you can guess. If you identify that landscape and then look at what your objectives are and move forward that, the first step would be to conduct that fire modeling and assessment to locate and prioritize your treatments. So then within that landscape that we're using for this example, you would identify the different types of habitat within that. So here we made the PACs this dark black color, and then recovery habitat is in, there's just pine oak in this example, so it's this bright green here. And then this other forest and woodland type is this green matrix of forest all around. So you have a better idea of how your protected activity centers are fitting into the landscapes that you're proposing to treat. So the next step being, as I described, you look at designating your nest roost cores within the PAC. And again, there's guidance within the plan on how exactly to do this if you don't already know. And so then if you're looking at trying to identify, okay, what 20% in the fictional landscape of PAC area would we treat, there's a lot of different ways you could go about this, and that's one of the points we just wanted to show with this series of slides, is you could look at, treating 20% of each of these PACs to reduce fire risk to these core areas. That would be one example. So this diagonally hatched area would be one proposed treatment. Notice that none of the nest cores are included within that mechanical treatment. Or you could do something, perhaps these PACs in the interior had much higher occupancy or something else, and you wanted to protect those much greater, so maybe you treated a greater proportion of these PACs along the southwestern edge if you were trying to protect from the prevailing direction of fire. So those just to give you a feel for how you might look at this or step through that process. So as Bill indicated, and I want to stress again, we currently do not have good information on the Mexican spotted owl response to thinning. We really don't know right now. There's one study that looked at the effects of thinning on the California spotted owl. However, it's kind of a difficult study to interpret and to use those results effectively for planning any treatments. It is highly likely that there are thresholds involved in modifying owl habitat. As thinning reduces parameters such as basal area and canopy cover, we may reduce habitat suitability for owls. And there may be a threshold beyond which the area would no longer function as owl habitat. We need to learn what those levels are. Similar thresholds may exist with respect to patch size, number of patches, spatial distribution of patches. But given the threatened status of the species, we need to proceed cautiously until we can answer some of these questions. I would emphasize, though, that proceeding cautiously doesn't mean avoiding owl habitat, but it does mean working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the recovery team, and others to design treatments and monitoring that help move our knowledge base forward rather than keep us at the state where we're constantly kind of wringing our hands and not knowing how do we do this. I'm going to skip through actually a couple of these so that we leave plenty of time for questions. I would, for this slide, I think the biggest point I wanted to make is we really want to avoid attempting to develop a single management target across the landscape. And I think this is similar for most ecologists in the Southwest. You know, given the extent of ecological variability we have here, the diversity of habitats we know that are used by Mexican spotted owls and other species, the goal of any treatments in these areas really should be managing for a range of stand conditions rather than trying to identify, you know, one single assumed optimal condition across the landscape. It's going to be really, really important as we proceed. There's a lot of challenges with this, as I'm sure everyone knows. I think it's one of the reasons why we didn't move as far forward after the 95 plan as we had hoped. We can go into those further, but I won't, like I said, I kind of want to keep us moving so we have plenty of time for questions. This is just another example of a larger landscape and one that's in the current revised recovery plan that really is trying to show that we need to take a big worldview image of this and look at where PACs are located across the landscape and how that fits into the overall treatment of the landscape. It shouldn't just be, oh, let's treat PACs. When you have a really limited habitat that we're currently unable to show we can create, we need to be really careful with that. There's a lot of forest restoration. The other point being there's a lot of forest restoration in all these other areas that can occur outside of protected and even within recovery habitat that will benefit both the owl and the landscape. So in conclusion, at least for now, I keep seeing all the questions coming up here, we really can't move forward at this point without learning from what we're doing. We need research and monitoring to understand how thinning and fire affects owls. We recognize that we have a significant threat to the birds now, and doing nothing is not an option, but we need to be smart in how we move forward and do a better job about collectively working together to have monitoring on certain projects where we can gain some knowledge and definitely improve our ability to do these treatments in and around owl habitat. Another really key point here is besides the monitoring of treatments and other activities that could occur within protected owl habitat and recovery habitat, we really need to be able to implement our overall population monitoring. And we need to know what the current trend of owls is. And that also should be used to help us inform how we do management across the landscapes it occurs on. So I think with that, we will open this up to questions.
Great. Thank you both, Shaula and Bill. That's a great presentation and a good kind of dive into the recovery plan. I guess I wanted to follow up on your last comment. Paul Sosinski typed in a question earlier, and Paul, if you want to clarify in the chat window, feel free. He was asking about, do you need to do surveys if your mixed conifer has burned up? And I think what Paul is getting at is, what are sort of the requirements or recommendations in an environment where you've probably lost some habitat due to an unplanned wildfire?
I can start this one, and then Bill, you can jump in if I forget something. But yeah, you do need to survey post-fire. Believe it or not, Mexican spotted owls have really high site fidelity, so even in areas that are fairly burned over, in the short term at least, we have continued to see occupancy. And it depends on the situation. I'm not going to say there's a blanket answer for every site, and I'm not going to say that every acre that's been burned then needs to be surveyed. But overall, my answer to that would be, yes, you should plan on surveys, particularly where you had designated PACs prior to the fire, and then work with the service to identify what component of that landscape needs to be surveyed.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Paul, feel free to type in a follow-up question if you want in the chat window. And in a second, we'll unmute the line so that those folks on the audio portion only can voice some questions. But in the meantime, I want to tackle two questions, one from Linda about mechanisms to track the 20% that's treated across the ecological management units in multiple forests and districts. And Taylor kind of chimed in on that and asked, well, you also might want to track those across time. So maybe Shaula or Bill, if you want to comment on how we can think about that on some of those larger landscapes that you mentioned.
Yep, so the service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, will be responsible for tracking, with a cooperation from our partners, for tracking that through space and time. And we're starting on a clean slate with the revised recovery plan, and we will be collecting that information from all of the land management agencies and compiling that yearly in terms of PAC acres treated so that we know when we're at that threshold.
Great.
And as Taylor pointed out, through time is important because you don't want to have, a significant proportion or in maybe a significant area of all your PAC acres treated at one time either. So we'll be working with all the land management agencies to develop a system whereby we can efficiently and effectively collect that information.
Okay, and there was another question, and maybe Taylor's follow-up, is this a 20% limit per year?
No, it's a 20% limit overall until we've learned enough to change that.
So that might even mean until the next revision.
Possibly, or until we have enough information to, by chance, modify, our current. It's a cap, and Bill can step in here and help me. But we established that as sort of a safety mechanism. We know, based on Finney's research, that you need to look at treating approximately 20% of the landscape strategically in order to reduce fire risk to important areas. And so we step that down and use that logic to apply to PACs, knowing that there are some areas where we really do, because of the existing condition, need to look at mechanically treating in PACs. And so that is a current limit until we get information to do something different on each ecological management unit.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think the key is that we've always cast this in an adaptive management framework, in that we really need to design some very rigorous and scientifically based monitoring to evaluate what the effects of these treatments and PACs are. We don't want to go in PACs with a real cavalier attitude, because these are protected activity centers, these are areas occupied by owls. So we need to be very conservative, and we need to learn from what we're doing.
So the questions are coming in fast and furious now. Maybe we'll sort of tackle one last question around this 20%, and Linda's asking, how do we determine which unit gets how much of the 20%? So sort of looking at that 20%, and you had some slides, Shaula, of how it could be divided up in a couple of different ways. And you mentioned that some of that's addressed in the plan, but I wonder if you want to dive in a little more deeply now.
Yeah, I think the landscape scale analysis gets at some of where that's determined going to occur. As we look at the landscape and the different land management agencies across the different ecological management units, I think there's this initial concern with the 20% that, oh my gosh, we'll have projects competing against one another, and that's really not the case. At least I don't perceive it to be. There's a lot of area that is covered within that. There's a lot of ongoing landscape scale projects within some of our key ecological management units, such as the Upper Gila Mountain Recovery Unit. And the service is working with its partners to make sure that, that 20% isn't, in the case of the owl, focused all in one area so that we reduce the ability of an area to provide for the owl, or isn't also spread so thin that we're not meeting the benefit that we were trying to achieve. Does that, Bill, do you want to?
Well, I think there's going to have to be a certain amount of coordination as well, because there's a number of different management entities within any ecological management unit area. So we'll have different agencies involved who also need to do various types of treatments. We're hoping to resurrect the implementation working teams for each EMU, and those teams will have a large role in helping to sort of identify the areas that we need to prioritize as far as treatments.
Great. We'll take 2 more questions here from the chat window, and then we'll jump to the phone line to give those folks a chance too. Paul Sazinski had a question about kind of the interaction between the goshawk guidelines and the recovery plan we're talking about today, and says, so outside of the 25% restricted area to be maintained for a threshold, the RO has been pushing for goshawk guideline desired conditions, i.e. patchy, groupy, clumpy with grassy areas in between and canopy cover measured on the basis of groups. And does that fit with the owl recovery plan as well?
Well, I would think you'd want to do that where appropriate for the particular forest type that you're working in. Certainly in the ponderosa pine-dominated forest, that type of structure I think is probably appropriate. Perhaps within some of the drier mixed conifer, it's appropriate as well. I think when you get onto the wetter mixed conifer, I think you're stretching it. And even within the pine type, when you get onto some of the more limestone soils, you know, that clumpy, groupy pattern may not be relevant or applicable.
Okay. And let's see. So I wanted to take Will's question, changing gears a little bit, and he mentions that it's increasingly evident that many ecosystems, once burned, don't necessarily come back to the same condition. And so is there a longer time scale contingency in the management plan for long-term ecosystem change? What, Shaula, Bill, you want to comment on sort of conversion of...
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to address that. I don't want to throw it on to Shaula, but Shaula, do you have any idea how to address that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question worthy of a longer discussion, but, you know, where we have, I'm not sure if he's talking about type conversion in some of these systems, and that has or is happening in some places, but we also have some severely burned landscapes that have patches left that are maintaining habitat for the owl. And in terms of the owl, you know, yeah, we're hopeful that this plan is incorporating acknowledgement of those potential long-term changes, but we're also hoping that, and I'm not sure I'm answering this correctly, that the adaptive management approach we're hoping to take and the learning we're hoping to gain in terms of how fire and or mechanical treatments work across the landscape, that we'll have a better idea of patch dynamics and what will work for the owl in the long term. You know, the other issue here sort of, it's not asked in the question, but the owl occupies a really diverse range of habitats across its range, including, you know, in canyons and it's not just in forested habitat, and I think that's an important point to remember in terms of this question as well. I'm not sure I answered it. I apologize.
Well, I think that in some ways is an impossible question to answer because we really don't know quite how much of these landscapes will convert. And I guess Will and his colleagues were calling in from Sarah Brown's class at Highlands University related to climate change, so they can follow up that conversation with her as well. I'm going to attempt to unmute the phone line and give folks on that side a chance to ask questions. So if you've got a lot going on in the background, please mute your individual line. So you now, participants, you can shout out and ask a question if you'd like.
What do we do? Can you hear?
Yes, there's an echo, but go ahead.
So what do we do when the Forest Service refuses to do the pre-monitoring and the post-monitoring like they did when the mandatory 95 monitoring was in place?
You want to, Bill or Shaula, you want to talk about monitoring and how to deal with?
Well, talk about two types of monitoring. I'm not entirely sure what the question was getting at, and Bill, jump in when I get this wrong. But in terms of project monitoring, I think most of the land management agencies have been trying to do the pre and post, but in a lot of cases, implementation has not happened, and so post-monitoring has not happened. In terms of population monitoring, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the recovery team are currently working with our partners to get that process off the ground and going, and that will be a multi-agency process across the range of the owl. But if I'm not entirely sure I answered the person's question correctly.
Let me take a stab at it. As far as the effectiveness monitoring of doing these treatments in PACs, the recovery team, I think, has been very clear and pretty firm that if we're not going to monitor, we don't think we should do the treatments, period.
Correct.
As far as the regulatory perspective, how that's enforced, that's probably remains to be seen. I mean, Shaula can maybe comment on how that would be enforced as far as from Fish and Wildlife Service.
Well, it's I don't know if enforcement is actually the word. We try to work with our partners to implement the recovery plan through all the different processes, and that's worked better in some cases and not as well in others. But I'm hopeful as we move through this process, and we already have started to design some large-scale monitoring across some large landscapes to look at the effects of treatment on owls pre and post, that this is going to be a different situation than we were in before.
And we're probably going to have more questions than we have time within our sort of allotted hour. And so Shaula and Bill, I wanted you guys to mention, I know you have some public meetings coming up, so if people, obviously they can follow up with you directly, but there's other opportunities to hear some of the same information again and maybe dive into other areas through questions, right?
Well, I think there's going to be a couple opportunities. We're going to hold implementation workshops, and we're still working on the details as to where and when those are going to be. Some of the questions that I see posed here in the chat part of the website here, I think were questions raised during the comment period to the draft of the revised plan. And I believe those questions and our responses of how we address those are going to appear on the Fish and Wildlife Service website if they're not there already. So there's going to be a couple opportunities, those implementation workshops and also looking at the questions or the comments posed on the draft revised recovery plan.
Okay, great. And the Southwest Fire Science Consortium will certainly share information about those implementation workshops when it's appropriate. Let's turn now to a question from Tony McWilliams about treatment on the Sacramento Ranger District. And this gets to this question of treatments that have already been done and how they may interact with the 20%, if I'm understanding it right. He asks, we've treated a good portion of PACs via the past recovery plan on the Sacramento District. How does this affect the Basin and Range East Recovery Unit or the Ecological Management Unit via the 20%?
It doesn't. We're starting over with the revised recovery plan. So as I said in the presentation, it starts with a clean slate. That doesn't mean we don't take into account what's happened in the past on the ground as we work collectively on these treatments, but those treatments do not count towards the 20%.
Okay, and a similar sort of question of counting, Craig Wilcox asks a question about the cool underburn that recovers fairly shortly being different from recovering to pre-treatment condition. Does that stay on sort of the treatment list as part of the 20%? or could you go back and retreat that or run that same sort of cool understory burn through again?
So the 20% applies to mechanical treatments across the EMUs. Prescribed burning is not included within that, although I would hope that we would be cognizant of, as Bill pointed out, there's different habitat types the bird occurs in, and I think it may take, as Craig indicates, multiple prescribed burns in some of these areas to meet your objectives, because you do want to keep that intensity fairly low, particularly within nest cores.
And I think, I'm guessing I know the answer to this now, but that Carolyn also asked about 20% of treatment in PACs and whether that would include areas burned by an unplanned wildfire, or whether that would be counted differently.
No. Wildfires contribute to the status of the species and their effect on existing habitat. They don't count towards the 20%.
Okay, great. Maybe I'll go ahead and try unmuting the line to give folks on the phone another chance here. So you phone folks,
see the plan.
A chance to type in a question, you can do so now.
We didn't really discuss the plan.
When will we see the monitoring plan?
The population monitoring?
Both the population and the landscape. And will treatments continue before the plans are done?
Well, I don't think there'll be one overall treatment monitoring plan, although we are trying to coordinate monitoring, getting at treatment effects across multiple large-scale projects. So that will kind of depend on how those projects evolve over the next year or two. In terms of the population monitoring, the framework is in Appendix E of the revised recovery plan, and we are working with a technical team and an administrative team right now to work on designing the pilot year for 2014 and to look at how we will fund that, not only for the pilot but for the long term. So we're hoping to have a plan for the pilot year by the end of this summer, early fall, if not sooner, and then have a long-term plan that will develop after the pilot year. Bill, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think there is some stuff in motion to move forward on it. We may have some opportunities. We were recently contacted by FIA as far as the habitat monitoring, which we think is the way we want to go with that. And they've actually initiated discussions with us to try to move that forward. So I think I've seen more activity related to monitoring in the last few months since the revised plan has come out than I did in the 18 years before that.
We're almost at our hour. Let me, Taylor has a sort of clarifying question about the sort of clean slate and then 20% of the areas being treated into the future. Does that apply to treatments that have been implemented already or treatments that have been approved, sort of, because obviously there are a number in process that might not have hit the ground yet?
I think how the team is viewing it, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is still working on ironing out the details in regards to this, but we're looking at new projects planned under the current recovery plan, so things that are in progress since December of last year.
Okay, great. So we can stick around after the end of the hour and do a few more questions if people are interested, but I know a number of people will have to drop off the webinar and phone line. There are opportunities for revisiting maybe particular portions of spotted owl recovery and management if people on this call are interested in proposing to the consortium to tackle a particular element of this in a future webinar, that would be fine. I mean, I think this is, for all of us in the Southwest, an important issue. And so I really appreciate Bill and Shaula putting a lot of energy into thinking through how to compact such a huge subject into a short time. And I appreciate everybody jumping on the line to talk today. We had more interest in this webinar than any other we've had. So that's one of the reasons we're thinking of maybe follow-ons or future efforts.
And Xander, I just want to add to that. We did have to condense a lot. And I know there's a lot more to this plan that we obviously did not have time to cover. Please feel free to contact me with questions if you have them. And you know, we really wanted to gear this, since the Southwest Fire Consortium was putting this together, more towards the fire end of it. And I apologize for those of you who may have expected more in terms of the plan. We just couldn't get there today.
And some people have asked about whether you'd be willing to share some version of PowerPoint. I don't know if that's something we could PDF and host on the Southwest Consortium page or some other way. And maybe I'll let you and Bill check in on that, but maybe we can send a follow-up email to participants about either the information or the PowerPoint itself.
Okay. We can work on putting something up.
Okay, great. Great. So anybody who wants to stick around, and I think probably works best with less echo and things, for people to type in questions in the chat window. I think Bill and Shaula would be willing to help answer some last questions if people have them. Maybe one thing that came up that we didn't get a chance to address yet is Linda's question about how do we handle forest plan revision definitions of dry versus wet mixed conifer, which are very different relative to MSO needs. And I don't know, maybe you may need some clarification on what Linda's getting at, but maybe you can jump off from there, Shaula or Bill.
No, I think we know what Linda's talking about. You know, I think we're just going to have to do our best to make sure that in terms of working towards recovery for the owl, we're working with all the land management agencies to ensure that their management is contributing towards its recovery. And, you know, in terms of the specifics for, you know, how the different types of mixed conifer are defined, I would argue that's going to be as much a learning process for the Forest Service as for us, because it's a continuum as mixed conifer moves up in elevation and aspect, and I think it's going to be a challenge.
Other questions out there? Any last minute? Let's see. A couple in here. New direction. Call for more research. As a researcher, that's always, of course, I always like that. That helps keep our research budgets going. And so Jody suggested that we might think about a webinar plan, to plan a webinar sometime in the future that would focus on mechanical treatments in PACs as opposed to fire. I think that's, you know, it's clearly the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, that's a little bit outside of what we usually do, but I think because obviously those treatments would be designed to change fire behavior, it would be within our purview. So we can talk. We have a couple scheduled out, so it probably wouldn't happen until the summer, but I think that might make some sense, hone down into some real specifics of how to make this sort of stuff happen.
Yeah, I think that's true, Xander, and I think maybe, you know, more towards the end of this year, we'll maybe have some areas where we've worked on putting some treatments in PACs, so we'll have some real-life experience to add to that discussion.
Well, now those areas might even be locations for field trips or getting out in the woods and looking at things. I'm a firm believer that everything is a little bit more clear when you can actually stand and look at what you're talking about rather than the abstract.
Ooh, I second that.
Okay, well, the flurry of questions seems to have stopped, so I think maybe we'll close it off there. And again, I want to thank the presenters and all the participants, and really apologize for some of the snafus early on. And we'll look forward to your participation in future Southwest Fire Science Consortium webinars. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to close down the webinar, and I think it should direct you right to a survey to get some feedback on what we've done right and where we could have improved. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Xander.